The mahogany dining table was set for two, the Cabernet breathing perfectly beside a vase of fresh, white hydrangeas. But the faint glow of Genevieve's unlocked iPad on the kitchen counter illuminated a single incoming message. The on-call room wasn't enough. Still tasting you. Grant didn't shatter the wine glass in his hand. He simply set it down, realizing the 10-year marriage he had built was a beautifully painted ghost story waiting for its brutal end. If the quiet devastation of broken vows and the cold, terrifying art of walking away draws you in, stay with me. The rain in Seattle always sounded different when you were alone. It didn't patter against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Mercer Island house. It smeared, blurring the city skyline into a wash of melancholic grays and bruised purples. Grant Foster stood in the shadows of the expansive kitchen, a heavy crystal tumbler of Macallan in his hand, listening to the ambient hum of the refrigerator. The house was perfectly quiet, save for the rain. It was an architectural marvel. He had designed himself a monument to the life he had built with Genevieve over 10 years. Clean lines, imported Italian marble, warm walnut accents. It was designed to catch the light. Right now, it felt like a tomb. On the kitchen island, Genevieve's iPad sat on its sleek charging dock. She had left it behind in her rush to get to Mitchell Healthcare for an emergency board meeting. The screen was dark, blending seamlessly into the black granite counter. Then it lit up. A soft, clinical ping echoed in the silence. Grant didn't typically look. He respected her privacy, a foundational pillar of the trust they supposedly shared. But the notification banner was glaringly bright in the dim room, and the name caught his eye before he could look away. Charles Mitchell Med. Grant took a sip of his scotch. He knew Charles Anderson, the chief of cardiology. Charming, relentlessly ambitious, a man who wore his arrogance like a tailored Brioni suit. Grant had golfed with him twice at the country club. Another ping, the screen illuminated again, the text expanding as a secondary message followed the first. The on-call room wasn't enough today. Missing the taste of you, Jen. I'll make up for the rushed ending on Friday. Grant stopped breathing. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt too thin, as if the oxygen had been vacuumed out through the ventilation system. He didn't drop his glass. He didn't roar in agony or sweep the carefully arranged hydrangeas off the counter. The reaction was profoundly internal. It was the sensation of a load-bearing wall being removed from a skyscraper. The structural integrity of his entire existence snapped in a terrifying, silent implosion. He walked slowly toward the island, his footsteps muffled by the Persian runner. He stared down at the glowing words until they burned into his retinas. The taste of you. For a man whose entire career was built on calculating stress points, assessing foundational strength, and preventing collapse, the irony tasted like copper in his mouth. His marriage had been failing structurally for months, perhaps years, and he had been too close to the facade to see the cracks. The late nights, the sudden fierce protection of her phone, the lingering scent of clinical soap, mixed with an unfamiliar cedarwood cologne when she slipped into bed at 2 a.m. He heard the faint rumble of the garage door opening. Genevieve was home. Grant's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a primal instinct urging him to confront, to scream, to demand answers. But as the interior door unlocked and the familiar click of her Louboutins echoed in the mudroom, a different instinct took over. A colder, more terrifying clarity settled over him. Yelling was a negotiation. Anger was a plea for things to be fixed. Grant didn't want to fix this. The building was already condemned. Genevieve walked into the kitchen looking exhausted but impeccably put together in her navy silk blouse and pencil skirt. She dropped her keys into the brass bowl and offered him a weary, beautiful smile. "Oh, what a nightmare of a day," she sighed, crossing the room to press a perfunctory kiss to his cheek. The board is tearing each other apart over the new pediatric wing budget. Grant smelled it then, beneath the expensive perfume and the sterile hospital scent. Cedarwood. He looked at his wife, truly looked at her, and realized he was staring at a stranger wearing the skin of the woman he loved. "I'm sorry to hear that," Grant said, his voice remarkably steady, devoid of the tremor he felt in his hands. He took another slow sip of his scotch. "You must be exhausted." "I am," she murmured, her eyes drifting toward the iPad. She smoothly picked it up, her thumb casually swiping to clear the notifications before looking back at him. "Did you eat?" "Not yet," Grant replied. He watched her slide the tablet into her leather tote. In that microsecond of deception, the blueprint of his revenge drafted itself in his mind. He wasn't going to raise his voice. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a messy emotional fallout. He was simply going to vanish and let the vacuum of his absence crush her. The hardest part was waking up beside her. For 3,650 mornings, the rhythm of Genevieve's breathing had been the metronome to Grant's life. When the motorized blackout shades hummed upward at 6:30, letting in the pale, overcast light of the Seattle morning, Grant was already awake. He had not slept. He had spent the night staring at the geometric shadows on the ceiling, carefully constructing a mental firewall between the husband who loved the woman sleeping beside him and the architect who needed to demolish her. Genevieve stirred the silk sheets rustling as she turned toward him. Her hand drifted across the mattress, blindly seeking his chest. For a fraction of a second, Grant's muscles coiled with the urge to recoil. The memory of the text message, "still tasting you," flashed behind his eyes like a strobe light in a dark room. He forced his muscles to relax. He let her hand rest over his heart, regulating his own pulse through sheer force of will. He was no longer a husband. He was an observer behind one-way glass. "Morning," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She cracked an eye open, offering him a sleepy, intimate smile. It was a smile that had anchored his world for a decade. Now he saw it for what it was, muscle memory. "Morning," Grant replied. His voice was smooth, a low baritone that betrayed nothing. He brushed a stray lock of dark hair from her forehead. The physical contact felt like touching a live wire, but his hand remained perfectly steady. An hour later, the scent of freshly ground Colombian roast filled the kitchen. Grant stood by the marble island, holding a mug, watching his wife prepare for her day. She was a vision of corporate armor, a slate gray blazer, a crisp white blouse, and a delicate gold pendant resting at her collarbone. But it was the details beneath the armor that caught his eye. As she reached up to retrieve a travel mug from the upper cabinet, her blouse shifted. Beneath the sheer white fabric, Grant caught the faint, unmistakable outline of black La Perla lace. It was a matching set they had bought together in Paris 3 years ago. She had explicitly complained that the underwire was too rigid for long days at the hospital, reserving it only for their anniversaries or private weekends. Today was a Tuesday. "I've got a brutal schedule today," Genevieve said, pouring her coffee. She kept her eyes fixed on the liquid, avoiding his gaze just a second longer than was natural. "The board is demanding a revised forecast for the cardiology wing by tomorrow morning. Charles and I are going to have to pull a late one to get the numbers aligned." The name dropped into the quiet kitchen like a stone into a still pond. Charles. Grant took a sip of his coffee. It tasted like ash. He analyzed her posture, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her thumb anxiously rubbed the handle of her travel mug. She was waiting for friction. She was waiting for the husband who usually complained about her long hours to put up a fight. "You've both been working incredibly hard on this expansion," Grant said, infusing his tone with warm, supportive sympathy. He walked over and gently squeezed her shoulder. "Just make sure you actually eat something for dinner, all right? Don't just run on espresso and hospital cafeteria sandwiches." Genevieve finally looked up, a flicker of genuine relief and perhaps a microscopic trace of guilt softening her eyes. "I promise. You're too good to me, Grant." "I just want what's best for you," he said softly. He watched her leave, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. The silence returned, rushing back into the house to fill the space she left behind. Grant walked over to the sink, carefully rinsed his mug, and placed it in the dishwasher. He had survived the first morning. The love he had harbored for a decade was rapidly calcifying into something cold hard and utterly unyielding. He walked down the hallway to his home office and picked up his phone. It was time to call Brian. The air inside the Roosevelt room was thick with the scent of aged leather, expensive bourbon, and the hushed, low-frequency hum of Seattle's power brokers making off-the-record deals. Rain lashed against the frosted glass of the establishment's discreet side street windows. Grant sat in a high-backed booth in the darkest corner of the room, rolling a heavy crystal glass between his palms. Across from him sat Brian Cooper. Brian was a partner at one of the city's most ruthless family law firms, a man whose tailored charcoal suits and mild manners effectively masked a predatory legal mind. He had known Grant since their days at the University of Washington. Brian stared at the surface of the mahogany table, digesting the quiet clinical recounting Grant had just delivered. For a long moment, the only sound between them was the clinking of ice in a nearby waiter's shaker. Charles Anderson, Brian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back, exhaling a slow breath. The chief of cardiology at Mitchell. Jesus, Grant. Are you absolutely certain the single text message on an iPad? I didn't just see a text, Grant interrupted, his tone chillingly flat. I saw the entire architecture of a lie, the late nights, the sudden changes in her wardrobe, the way she looks at her phone when it vibrates. It's all structural. Once you know the foundation is compromised, you see the cracks in every wall. Brian studied his oldest friend. He had guided men through the wreckage of infidelity 100 times. Usually they were weeping, shaking with rage, or demanding immediate scorched earth vengeance. Grant was none of those things. His eyes were entirely dead. It was a stillness that made the hairs on Brian's arms stand up. Okay, Brian said, shifting into attorney mode. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and began tapping it softly against his thumb. If we file on Monday, Washington is a community property state. We are looking at a 50-50 split of all marital assets. The Mercer Island house, the joint investment portfolios, and worse, the valuation of your architectural firm. Her name is on the secondary founding documents, Grant. Her corporate lawyers will drag this out for 3 years and bleed your firm dry just for leverage. She doesn't get the firm, Grant stated. He took a sip of his bourbon. And she doesn't get the satisfaction of a fight. I am not going to sit in a mediation room and listen to her explain why she did it. I am not going to negotiate for the blueprints of my own life. Brian stopped tapping the pen. Then what are you asking me to do? I want you to build me an exit, Grant said, leaning forward. The dim light caught the sharp angles of his jaw. I want to slowly, quietly sever every financial artery connecting my life to hers. Reroute the firm's incoming capital into private trusts. Liquidate the joint accounts by tying them up in new investments. Untangle the liability of the house. I want everything locked, sealed, and out of her reach. Grant moving marital assets without disclosure is a massive risk. If she or her accountants notice a sudden drain in liquidity, the court will penalize you heavily. She won't notice, Grant said smoothly. She is currently orchestrating a multi-million-dollar hospital expansion while managing an intense high-risk affair with a senior doctor. Her attention is completely fractured. She's signing whatever I put in front of her because she feels guilty and because she wants to avoid looking too closely at me. Brian sighed, seeing the immovable resolve in his friend's eyes. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. It will take time, Brian warned, writing down a single-word restructure. Months, maybe. You will have to go home every single night, sleep in the same bed, eat dinner with her, and act like the perfect, oblivious husband while I dismantle your marriage on paper. Can you do that? Can you look at her knowing where she's been and not say a word? Grant thought of the black lace beneath the white silk blouse. He thought of the smell of cedarwood. I build skyscrapers, Grant said softly. I know exactly how to erect a facade. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel hummed with the curated frequency of Seattle's wealthiest philanthropists. A string quartet played a low classical arrangement in the corner, nearly drowned out by the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the rustle of designer silk. Tonight was the annual Mitchell Healthcare Winter Gala, a multi-million-dollar fundraising event, and Genevieve was its undisputed queen. She wore a backless emerald green velvet gown that moved like water over her frame. Grant stood near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, watching her work the room. She was brilliant. She moved from board members to city councilmen, offering the perfect blend of corporate intellect and warm charm. To the hundreds of people in the room, they were the city's golden couple, the visionary architect and the fierce healthcare executive. Then the crowd parted subtly near the bar, and the temperature in Grant's veins dropped to absolute zero. Charles Anderson. He was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. He possessed the kind of easy, arrogant magnetism typical of top-tier surgeons, a man entirely accustomed to holding life and death in his hands and being worshipped for it. Grant watched as Charles locked eyes with Genevieve from across the room. It was a micro-expression lasting less than a second, a slight dip of his chin, a darkening of his gaze, but to a man trained to notice structural anomalies, it was as subtle as a wrecking ball. Genevieve's posture shifted. Her spine stiffened imperceptibly, and her professional smile softened into something far more private, far more dangerous. "Grant, darling," Genevieve's voice drifted over the ambient noise as she approached, her hand lightly resting on his bicep. She brought the scent of champagne and cedarwood with her. "You remember Dr. Anderson, don't you, Charles, from the cardiology department?" "Of course," Grant said. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone. He turned, allowing a polite, welcoming smile to spread across his face. Charles stepped forward, offering his hand. "Grant, good to see you again. I believe the last time was on the back nine at Broadmoor. You took $50 from me." Grant looked at the outstretched hand. This was the hand that unbuttoned his wife's blouses. This was the hand that had typed the words "tasting you" on a screen left carelessly on a kitchen counter. Grant reached out and gripped Charles's hand firmly. The surgeon's grip was strong, an alpha male assertion wrapped in country club politeness. Grant matched the pressure perfectly, his eyes crinkling at the corners in fabricated warmth. "I got lucky on the 14th hole, Charles." "Good to see you," Grant lied smoothly. "Genevieve has been doing incredible work with the pediatric expansion." Charles said, his eyes shifting to her. There was a possessive weight to his gaze, a quiet gloating that only the two of them were meant to understand. "We spend so much time reviewing blueprints these days, I feel like I'm doing your job, Grant." Genevieve offered a light musical laugh, but Grant noticed a slight tightening of her jaw. She was nervous. She was playing with fire in a room full of gasoline, thrilled by the proximity, but terrified of a spark. "I'm glad she has such dedicated colleagues," Grant replied, taking a slow sip of his water, letting his eyes bounce naturally between the two of them. "It takes a lot off my mind, knowing she's in good hands when she's working these late nights." The double meaning hung in the air, entirely invisible to Genevieve and Charles, who simply saw a supportive, oblivious husband. Charles offered a self-satisfied smirk, raising his glass. "We make a great team," Charles said. "I'm sure you do." Grant smiled, the expression hollow and terrifyingly cold behind his eyes. As the gala photographer approached, asking for a picture of the Mitchell healthcare leadership, Genevieve stepped smoothly to Charles's side. Grant took a step back into the shadows of the ice sculpture, watching the flashbulbs ignite. He didn't feel anger anymore. He only felt the cold, methodical countdown of a demolition timer ticking down to zero. The architectural plans spread across Grant's drafting table were an elaborate, meaningless prop. Beneath the tracing paper, in the silver drafting compass, lay a meticulously organized stack of legal documents prepared by Brian Cooper. They were heavy, printed on thick, watermarked paper. To a casual observer, they looked like standard corporate restructuring forms. To a forensic accountant, they were a masterclass in asset evaporation. Through a labyrinth of new LLCs and blind trusts, Grant was systematically removing Genevieve's name from the secondary founding documents of Foster and Associates. He was transferring their liquid cash into offshore holdings disguised as overseas commercial real estate investments. It was a flawless, invisible demolition. Grant checked his watch. 9:40 in the evening. He heard the soft padding of Genevieve's bare feet on the hardwood floor of the hallway. She appeared in the doorway of his office wearing a silk robe, holding a glass of Pinot Noir in one hand and her phone in the other. The screen cast a pale, bluish glow against her face. She was smiling at whatever she was reading, a private, intoxicating smile that vanished the second she looked up and saw him. "Still working?" she asked, her voice light, attempting to mask the sudden shift in her demeanor. She placed the phone face down on the edge of his desk. "Just wrapping up," Grant said, his tone perfectly measured, radiating the tired warmth of a dedicated husband. He gathered the stack of legal papers and tapped the edges against the mahogany desk to align them. "Actually, I'm glad you're still awake. I need your signature on a few things." Genevieve sighed, taking a sip of her wine. "Can it wait until tomorrow, Grant? My brain is completely fried. Charles and I spent 6 hours fighting the hospital board over the equipment budget today." Grant felt a phantom knife twist in his ribs at the casual, almost brazen mention of her lover's name. It was a psychological shield she had developed over the past few weeks, mentioning Charles in mundane contexts to normalize his presence in their lives. "I know you're exhausted," Grant said smoothly, stepping around the desk. He handed her a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. "It will take 2 minutes. My accountant is pushing me to restructure the firm's liability insurance before the end of the fiscal quarter. It's mostly tax mitigation. moving some of our shared equity into a holding company to protect our personal assets from any potential lawsuits against the firm. It was a brilliant lie tailored exactly to her corporate sensibilities. He used words she understood: liability, mitigation, asset protection. He framed the erasure of her wealth as a shield for her benefit. Genevieve took the pen. She didn't look at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. Her eyes drifted to her phone, which vibrated silently against the wood, the screen lighting up. Even upside down, Grant could see the notification block. He didn't need to read it to know who it was from. She was distracted by the thrill of the chase, entirely unaware that the ground beneath her was giving way. "Right here," Grant said, pointing to a yellow sticky tab. Genevieve leaned over the desk. The silk robe fell open slightly, and the scent of her expensive skin cream filled the space between them. She pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. "You really should have Brian review these things before you just blindly agree to what your accountant says, Grant," she murmured, an edge of patronizing fondness in her voice. "I trust the people I work with," Grant replied softly. Genevieve signed her name with a fluid, elegant flourish. Genevieve Hartwell Foster. She flipped to the next page, signing again and again. With every stroke of blue ink, she was legally divorcing herself from millions of dollars, surrendering her safety net, and dismantling the empire she thought she co-owned. "There," she said, capping the pen and handing it back to him. She immediately picked up her phone, her thumb already unlocking the screen. "All yours." "Thank you," Grant said. He took the documents, his hands perfectly steady. He watched her walk out of the office, her attention already miles away, lost in the digital glow of a man who would ruin her. Grant looked down at the fresh signatures, the ink still gleaming under the desk lamp. The trap had officially snapped shut. Saturday mornings in the Mercer Island house were usually sacred, bathed in the soft, diffused light pouring through the east-facing windows. Grant stood by the kitchen island, the espresso machine hissing softly behind him as it extracted a double shot. His phone was pressed to his ear. "Yes, the Tribeca loft," Grant said quietly, his eyes tracking a ferry moving slowly across Lake Washington. "If we waive the inspection contingency, can we expedite the closing to the 15th of next month? I need the transition to be immediate." On the other end of the line, his New York broker Marcus rattled off a list of banking requirements. Grant nodded, his mind already calculating the logistics of moving his drafting tables 3,000 miles away. "Understood," Grant murmured. "And just to reiterate, the deed is to be filed strictly under my LLC. Genevieve's name is not to appear anywhere on the title or the escrow documents. It is a sole." The subtle metallic click of the front door opening sent a spike of pure ice straight into Grant's adrenal glands. He hadn't heard her car pull into the driveway. Genevieve was supposed to be at a 90-minute Pilates session in Bellevue, followed by brunch with her sister. It was barely 10:30. Grant didn't flinch. He didn't drop his voice to a whisper or abruptly hang up the phone, movements that screamed guilt. Instead, as the sound of her athletic shoes squeaked against the hardwood of the foyer, he seamlessly pivoted the trajectory of his sentence without breaking his cadence. "Sole proprietorship, bid Marcus," Grant continued smoothly, turning around just as Genevieve walked into the kitchen. "If this boutique hotel group wants Foster and Associates to handle the Tribeca commercial renovation, we need to ensure the zoning permits allow for a full structural overhaul before we commit to the site." Genevieve paused by the granite counter, dropping her gym bag onto a bar stool. She was wearing black Lululemon leggings and a moisture-wicking jacket, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. But there was no flush of exertion on her cheeks. She didn't smell like a gym. She smelled like expensive hotel coffee and a faint trace of the cedarwood cologne that haunted Grant's nightmares. "Right," Grant said into the phone, offering his wife a casual, welcoming smile. "Draft the preliminary proposal and send it to my secure email. I'll review it on Monday." "Thanks, Marcus." He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the island. The silence in the kitchen felt razor sharp. "You're home early," Grant noted, turning back to the espresso machine to pour the dark liquid into a ceramic mug. "I thought you were meeting Nora for brunch." Genevieve crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. Her dark eyes, usually so composed, held a faint defensive narrowing. It was the hypervigilance of a liar, someone who, swimming in her own deceptions, subconsciously assumed the water was dirty everywhere. Nora canceled. Her kids have the flu, Genevieve said. Her gaze flicked to his phone. Tribeca. Since when is your firm looking at commercial bids in New York? Since the Seattle commercial real estate market started cooling off. Grant lied effortlessly, handing her the freshly made espresso. A hospitality group approached us last week. It's a massive undertaking, mostly exploratory at this stage. I didn't want to bore you with the zoning logistics. Genevieve took the mug, wrapping both hands around the warm ceramic. She stared at him over the rim for 5 excruciating seconds. Grant stood perfectly still under the microscopic scrutiny of a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar hospital budgets for a living. He kept his breathing shallow, his face a mask of mild domestic pleasantry. If she pushed, if she asked to see the email, if she realized that Foster and Associates hadn't taken a commercial hotel contract in 4 years. New York, Genevieve finally murmured, taking a sip of the coffee. The tension in her shoulders dropped, replaced by a self-absorbed sigh. God, Grant, if you take a project in Manhattan, you'll be flying back and forth for months. I barely see you as it is with the pediatric wing expansion. It's just a proposal, Genmo, Grant said softly. Nothing is set in stone. Good, she whispered, offering him a tight, slightly guilty smile. I'm going to take a shower. Grant watched her walk away, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Only when he heard the heavy glass door of the master shower slide shut did he allow himself to exhale. His hand, resting flat against the marble counter, was trembling slightly. The thread had almost snapped. The ghost had almost been seen. The storm rolling off the Puget Sound was relentless, lashing the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room with heavy, rhythmic sheets of water. Grant sat in the leather armchair by the unlit fireplace, listening to the rain. The house was submerged in the deep blue shadows of early evening. When Genevieve finally walked through the front door, she did not possess the sharp, polished energy of an executive director. She looked frayed. The hem of her trench coat was damp, her usually immaculate hair was windblown, and she dropped her keys onto the console table with a harsh metallic clatter that echoed too loudly in the quiet house. Grant watched her from the shadows. He could read the structural fatigue in her posture. She walked straight to the wet bar, bypassing him entirely, and poured a generous measure of gin into a lowball glass. Her hands were shaking. Grant remained perfectly still, observing the microfractures in her composure. Bad day, he asked quietly. Genevieve flinched, splashing a few drops of liquor onto the polished mahogany. She hadn't seen him sitting there. She pressed a hand to her chest, taking a sharp breath. God, Grant, you startled me. She took a long, ungraceful swallow of the gin. The ice clinked violently against the glass. It was horrible. The board is breathing down my neck. The contractors are delayed, and Charles. She stopped biting her lower lip. And Charles? Grant prompted, his voice smooth and remarkably gentle. He was impossible today. She snapped, the frustration bleeding through her corporate filter. He overstepped. He tried to override my scheduling authority in front of the department heads. He thinks because he brings in the surgical revenue, he can just dictate terms. It was humiliating. Grant absorbed the information, translating the subtext. It wasn't about scheduling. The affair was losing its frictionless hotel room glamour. The boundaries were bleeding. Charles, arrogant and possessive, was likely exerting his dominance over her in the daylight, pulling the leash a little too tight for Genevieve's liking. She walked over to the leather sofa opposite him and sank into the cushions, pulling her knees to her chest. The armor had completely fallen away, leaving behind a tired, frightened woman who suddenly realized the ice she was skating on was terrifyingly thin. She looked across the coffee table at Grant. Her eyes were wide, shining with unshed tears of overwhelming stress. "Can you just come sit with me?" she whispered. It was a simple request. 10 weeks ago, Grant would have crossed the room in a heartbeat, pulling her into his arms to shield her from the world. Now the prospect of touching her felt like stepping into an incinerator. But the architect knew his role. Grant stood up, his face an impassive mask of marital concern, and walked over to the sofa. He sat beside her. Immediately, Genevieve collapsed against him. She buried her face in the curve of his neck, her hands gripping the fabric of his sweater as if he were a life raft. He felt the dampness of her tears against his collarbone. He smelled the juniper of the gin on her breath. "I'm so exhausted, Grant," she sobbed softly into his skin. Tell me everything is going to be okay. Please. She was seeking asylum from the storm she had created with another man. It was the ultimate grotesque irony. Grant slowly raised his arm, fighting every instinct in his nervous system that screamed at him to push her away. He let his hand rest on her back, his fingers gently stroking her spine in a practiced rhythmic motion. Shh, Grant murmured, staring blankly at the rain battering the dark glass across the room. His voice was a hollow, soothing frequency. Everything is perfectly fine, Jenda. You're home now. I've got you. He held her there in the dark, comforting in the woman who had destroyed his life, his hands steady, his heart entirely dead, counting down the days until she had absolutely nothing left to hold on to. The scent of brown butter, seared scallops, and roasted sage drifted through the ambient warmth of the kitchen. Grant moved with the precise, practiced rhythm of a man who had cooked this exact meal a dozen times before. It was Genevieve's favorite. On the dining table, two heavy crystal glasses caught the dim amber glow of the chandelier waiting to be filled with the 2014 Cabernet he had pulled from the cellar. Tomorrow morning, Genevieve was flying to Chicago for a 3-day regional healthcare symposium. Tomorrow morning, Grant was erasing himself from her life. He heard the distinct click of a suitcase latch snapping shut down the hall, followed by the soft sound of Genevieve's footsteps. She walked into the dining room wearing a simple, elegant cashmere sweater and silk trousers, her hair loose around her shoulders. She stopped, taking in the beautifully set table, the white hydrangeas in the center, and the steam rising from the plates Grant was carrying. A flicker of genuine surprise, and perhaps a ghost of guilt, crossed her features. Grant, she breathed, her voice softening. You didn't have to do all this. My flight is at 6 in the morning. I could have just ordered something. I wanted to, Grant said. His voice was perfectly level, a calm surface hiding an ocean of dead water. He pulled out her chair. You're going to be eating hotel banquet food for the next 3 days. I thought you deserved a decent meal before you left. Genevieve sat down, offering him a smile that looked terrifyingly like the woman he used to love. Thank you, it smells incredible. Grant took his seat across from her and poured the wine. The dark red liquid swirled in the glass, rich and opaque. They began to eat. The clinking of heavy silver forks against porcelain was the only sound in the room for a long time. It was a silence filled with ghosts. Is Charles presenting the pediatric cardiology data at this conference? Grant asked casually, cutting into a scallop. He didn't look up, keeping his tone entirely conversational. Genevieve paused, her wine glass halfway to her lips. The hesitation lasted barely a second, but to Grant it was as loud as a gunshot. Yes, she said smoothly, taking a sip. He's leading the panel on Saturday afternoon. It's a critical presentation for the hospital's funding. Well, I'm sure it will be a very productive weekend for you both, Grant replied. He raised his glass to her, the crystal catching the light. A productive weekend. Grant knew exactly where they were going. Brian's private investigator had tracked the booking 2 days ago. They weren't going to Chicago. They were flying to a secluded luxury vineyard estate in Napa Valley. I'll miss you, Genevieve murmured, reaching across the mahogany table to lightly touch his hand. Her skin was warm. I hate these trips. I'd much rather be here with you. Grant looked down at her hand resting on his. He felt no anger. He felt no betrayal. He felt exactly what a demolition expert feels when looking at a condemned building moments before pressing the detonator. It was just architecture. It was just structure giving way to gravity. He gently turned his hand, threading his fingers through hers, giving her a reassuring, entirely hollow squeeze. It's only 3 days, Jen, Grant said softly, his eyes meeting hers. He allowed a quiet, melancholic smile to touch his lips, letting her misinterpret the profound finality in his gaze as marital affection. The time will pass before you know it, and when you get back, everything will be completely different. Genevieve smiled back, entirely oblivious to the absolute truth of his words. They finished their dinner in quiet harmony, two strangers sharing a perfectly painted ghost story, unaware that only one of them would survive the morning. At 5:30 in the morning, the black Lincoln town car idled in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the thick Seattle fog. Genevieve stood in the foyer, adjusting the collar of her beige Burberry trench coat. She looked flawless, vibrating with a suppressed nervous energy that she attributed to an early flight, but which Grant knew was the thrill of her impending rendezvous. "I'll call you when I land," she said, leaning in to press a fleeting kiss to his jaw. "Safe travels," Grant replied. His voice was a calm, steady anchor. "Enjoy the symposium." He stood on the porch and watched the taillights of the town car bleed into the fog until they completely disappeared down the winding road. He didn't move for a long time. He just listened to the drip of the moisture from the eaves. The performance was over. Grant walked back inside and locked the heavy oak door. The silence of the house was no longer suffocating. It was a canvas. He moved straight to his home office and woke up his monitors. On the left screen, he pulled up a live aviation tracker. He typed in her flight number. He watched the small digital airplane taxi onto the runway at SeaTac, waiting for the exact moment of liftoff. At 6:12, the altitude numbers began to climb. She was airborne. She was unreachable. On the right screen, Grant opened the administrative panel for the house's shared local servers. 10 years of digital architecture, joint tax returns, scanned mortgage documents, thousands of shared photographs from Paris, Rome, and Maui, and the digital backups of his architectural firm. With a few swift, precise keystrokes, he initiated a secure military-grade data wipe on his partitions. He watched the progress bar inch forward, systematically destroying his digital footprint in her life. It was a sterile, quiet death. Next was the physical extraction. Grant didn't hire a moving company. A moving truck was an event. It invited questions from neighbors. He had slowly been moving his essential equipment and books to his downtown office for weeks. All that remained were his clothes and his personal effects. He carried 2 large structured leather duffels into the master closet. He worked methodically. He did not touch a single item of hers. He merely removed his tailored suits, his crisp dress shirts, his ties, and his shoes. The removal created a stark physical void. The row of heavy wooden hangers, now entirely empty, swung gently against each other with a hollow wooden clatter. Her vibrant silks and cashmeres were suddenly juxtaposed against a dark, empty wall. It looked exactly like what it was in amputation. He moved to the master bathroom, clearing his razors, his aftershave, his toothbrush. He wiped down the marble vanity, leaving no stray hairs, no water rings. He erased his existence right down to the microscopic level. By 9 o'clock, the bags were loaded into the trunk of his Audi. The house was immaculate. Grant walked into the kitchen one last time. The space was filled with the gray morning light. He approached the dark granite island, where weeks ago a glowing iPad had fundamentally altered the trajectory of his universe. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he withdrew a thick, sealed manila envelope. The return address in the corner read Cooper and Associates Family Law. Inside were the finalized filed divorce papers, a restraining order on all liquidated marital assets, and a printed screenshot of the single text message that had started it all. Grant placed the envelope precisely in the center of the island. He didn't leave a handwritten note. He didn't leave his wedding ring. He had packed it, refusing to give her the cinematic satisfaction of finding it abandoned. He simply turned around, walked out the front door, and drove away, leaving behind a beautifully designed multi-million-dollar tomb. The black Uber SUV idled at the base of the driveway, its taillights reflecting off the wet pavement as Genevieve retrieved her Louis Vuitton weekender bag. It was Sunday evening. The Napa Valley sun had left a faint warm flush on her collarbones, and her body still hummed with the lingering, intoxicating adrenaline of a stolen weekend. She had spent 3 days wrapped in Egyptian cotton and Cabernet, with Charles far removed from the sterile politics of Mitchell Healthcare and the quiet predictability of her husband. She walked up the stone pathway, her heels clicking softly in the damp Seattle air. She mentally rehearsed the Chicago symposium itinerary, preparing the lies she would feed Grant over a glass of wine. The keynote was exhausting. The pediatric panel ran late. She unlocked the heavy oak door and pushed it open. "Grant, I'm home," she called out, slipping off her trench coat. The house did not respond. There was no ambient jazz playing from the living room speakers, no scent of dinner lingering in the air, no warm baritone voice welcoming her back. There was only the low mechanical hum of the refrigerator and an unnatural heavy stillness. The air inside felt stale, as if the house had been holding its breath for days. Genevieve frowned, walking into the dimly lit kitchen. Her eyes immediately landed on the dark granite island. Sitting precisely in the center was a thick manila envelope. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of her neck. She dropped her bag onto the floor and approached the counter. The return address in the upper left corner was printed in sharp, uncompromising, black ink, Cooper and Associates Family Law. She knew Brian Cooper. He was Grant's oldest friend. He was also a ruthless divorce attorney. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tore the seal. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. Clipped to the very front was a single sheet of standard printer paper. It wasn't a legal form. It was a high-resolution screenshot. Genevieve stared at it. It was a picture of her own iPad lock screen. The text bubble was glaringly legible. The on-call room wasn't enough today. Missing the taste of Eugene, the oxygen vanished from the room. Genevieve let out a choked, involuntary gasp, dropping the paper as if it had burned her. The floor seemed to tilt violently beneath her feet. She grabbed the edge of the granite counter to steady herself, her heart slamming against her ribs with the force of a panic attack. He knew. The realization hit her not with a bang, but with the terrifying, suffocating weight of an avalanche. He knew. He had known when he kissed her cheek. He had known when he poured her coffee, when he asked her to sign the corporate restructuring documents, when he cooked her scallops on Friday night and held her hand across the table. Frantically, her eyes scanned the legal documents beneath the screenshot. Irreconcilable differences, dissolution of marriage. But it was the financial injunctions that made her blood run entirely cold. Temporary restraining order on all shared marital assets. Transfer of primary LLC holdings. Freezing of joint accounts. The paper she had blindly signed in his office a week ago hadn't been for liability insurance. She had signed away her own empire. "Grant!" she screamed, the sound tearing from her throat, desperate and shrill. She abandoned the papers and ran down the hallway. She threw open the door to the master suite. It was immaculately clean. She rushed into the walk-in closet, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The left side of the closet was an abyss. A long, uninterrupted row of empty wooden hangers hung from the metal rod. They swayed slightly from the draft of the open door, clinking together with a hollow, mocking sound. His shoes were gone. His ties were gone. In the master bathroom, the vanity was entirely cleared of his existence. There was nothing left to yell at. There was no argument to win, no manipulation to employ, no tears to use as a shield. Grant had denied her the closure of a fight. He had simply looked at the diseased architecture of their marriage, calculated the structural collapse, and stepped out of the building before it fell. Genevieve sank to the floor of the empty closet, her back pressing against the cold, mirrored wall, and buried her face in her hands as the silence of the house finally crushed her. The acoustic dampening of the Mitchell Healthcare Executive Suites was specifically designed to absorb noise and protect high-level corporate secrets. By Wednesday morning, it was entirely ineffective against the deafening silence that followed Genevieve down the hallway. She walked with her chin held high, her slate-gray Armani suit functioning as a final desperate layer of armor. But she could feel the gravity shifting in the building. When she passed the glass-walled conference rooms, conversations abruptly paused. Her executive assistant, usually a fountain of morning chatter, handed over her coffee without making eye contact, her gaze fixed nervously on the carpet. Brian Cooper had not just filed for divorce. He had filed a labyrinth of aggressive financial injunctions. To legally justify the freezing of their joint assets, Brian had subpoenaed Mitchell Healthcare's server records to establish a timeline of Genevieve's affair, proving she had been utilizing marital funds and company time for her rendezvous. The legal department had been forced to comply. Within 48 hours, the rumors had bypassed the legal team and saturated the board of directors. She was no longer the visionary executive director. She was a walking, breathing liability. Genevieve retreated into her corner office and shut the heavy mahogany door. Her hands were trembling so violently, she had to set her coffee down on the desk. She needed an anchor. She needed the man who had promised her that what they had was worth the risk. She picked up her phone and bypassed the text thread, dialing Charles's private extension directly. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. She tried his cell, again, straight to voicemail. A cold panic seized her chest. She left her office, taking the private staff elevator down to the 4th-floor cardiology wing. The clinical smell of antiseptic and bleached linens, which had once felt like the backdrop to a thrilling romance, now made her deeply nauseous. She found Charles standing near the nurse's station reviewing a digital chart. He looked up as she approached. The magnetic, arrogant warmth that usually radiated from him was completely gone. His eyes were flat-guarded and explicitly hostile. Charles, she said, keeping her voice low, aware of the two nurses standing 10 feet away. I need to talk to you. You aren't answering your phone. Genevieve, I am in the middle of rounds, Charles replied. His voice was a sterile monotone loud enough for the nurses to hear. He did not use the intimate Jen. He did not step closer to her. Please, she whispered, stepping into his personal space, desperate for a fracture in his clinical facade. Just 5 minutes, in your office. Grant found out. He took everything, Charles. My accounts are frozen. The board is looking at me like I'm a contagion. Charles looked down at her. In that fraction of a second, Genevieve saw the absolute truth of their relationship. He wasn't looking at a woman he loved. He was looking at a ruined structure that threatened to collapse onto him. I heard about the subpoenas, Charles said quietly, his voice dropping to a vicious, hissing whisper. Legal called me in yesterday to review my emails. Do you have any idea of the position you have put me in? The chief of surgery position opens up in 6 months. The board has a strict morality clause for senior department heads. Genevieve stared at him, the blood draining from her face. What are you saying? We were in Napa 3 days ago. You said. What I said was said in a hotel room, Genevieve. Charles cut her off, his eyes sweeping the hallway nervously. The scent of his cedarwood cologne was suffocating her. This is reality. You brought your messy, vindictive husband's legal war into my hospital. I can't be associated with this. I can't be associated with you. He didn't wait for a response. He handed the tablet to a passing nurse and turned his back on her, walking swiftly down the corridor, adjusting his pristine white coat as he went. Genevieve stood entirely alone in the blinding fluorescent light of the cardiology wing. The illusion was completely shattered. She had burned down a 10-year marriage for a man who viewed her as nothing more than a temporary high-risk diversion. Grant hadn't just taken her money and her home. He had orchestrated the perfect environment for her to realize in front of everyone she respected that she was absolutely worthless. It had been exactly 365 days since the foundation gave way. Genevieve sat at a small imitation wood table in a cramped one-bedroom apartment in Bellevue. Outside, the Seattle rain battered against the single-pane window, but there was no sweeping view of the Puget Sound or the manicured lawns of Mercer Island. There was only the grim fluorescent glow of a gas station across the street reflecting off the wet asphalt. She was no longer the executive director of Mitchell Healthcare. The board of directors had quietly pressured her to resign 6 months ago, offering a meager severance package to sweep the scandal under the rug. Without her joint assets and heavily penalized by the legal fallout of utilizing company resources during her affair, her financial safety net had evaporated. Charles Anderson had retained his position as chief of cardiology, cleanly severing her from his life, as though she were a benign tumor he had successfully excised. Genevieve reached for her glass, taking a sip of cheap supermarket Pinot Noir. On the table rested the latest issue of Architectural Digest. The glossy cover featured a sweeping multi-million-dollar Tribeca hotel renovation. The headline read, "Foster and Associates redefines Manhattan minimalism." With a trembling finger, she traced the letters of Grant's name. She turned to the center spread. There he was. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched a fraction deeper, but he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his frame with effortless authority. He wasn't smiling in the photograph, but there was an immovable strength in his posture. He looked like a man who had survived a collapse and rebuilt himself out of titanium. She closed the magazine, the sound unnaturally loud in the tiny room. The silence of the apartment was suffocating. It wasn't the luxurious, curated quiet of her past life. It was the heavy, echoing isolation of absolute ruin. She had traded a man who built monuments for her for a man who wouldn't risk a professional reprimand to save her. Grant had never raised his voice. He had never thrown a glass or demanded an apology. He had just meticulously packed his life, walked out the door, and let her own choices crush her. 3,000 miles away, the late afternoon sun painted the Manhattan skyline in brilliant streaks of copper and gold. Grant Foster stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new Tribeca office, his hands resting in the pockets of his slacks. The hum of the city below was a steady, rhythmic pulse, a stark contrast to the haunting, melancholic rain of his former life. Behind him, his new drafting table was covered in blueprints for a massive commercial development in Brooklyn. His firm was thriving. He had successfully rerouted his assets, rebuilt his portfolio, and insulated himself from the wreckage of his past with a precision that bordered on the ruthless. He raised his ceramic mug, taking a slow sip. The coffee was black and bitter, exactly the way he preferred it now. There were still nights when the phantom scent of cedarwood and clinical soap drifted into his memory, when the ghost of a 10-year marriage lingered in the shadows of his new penthouse. A betrayal of that magnitude didn't simply evaporate. It calcified into the architecture of who he was. He would never be the same man who had innocently kissed his wife's cheek in a custom-built kitchen. The blind innocence was gone, replaced by a cold, protective vigilance. But as Grant looked out over the sprawling, infinite geometry of New York City, he felt a profound, grounded peace. The air in his lungs belonged entirely to him. He no longer had to analyze the tone of a text message or brace himself against the lies of the person sleeping beside him. He turned away from the window, walking back to his drafting table. He picked up his silver compass and began to draw a new line, clean and unwavering. He had survived the demolition, and he knew with the absolute certainty of a master architect that leaving her in the deafening silence of her own destruction was the most perfect thing he had ever built.